The moment is here, you can stop your search. It's Comics by Perch.
Hey everybody, it's your buddy Perch. Yeah, isn't it gonna be sad when I'm gone? I mean, not for some of you. I know. But for some of you, it's like, yeah, the only way you're gonna be able to hear kind of these sappy intros and other things, you go back and you listen to the old material. A lot of that stuff sucks. You're gonna have to go back and listen to me breaking the story about Dan Didio getting fired. That won't be a lot of fun in 2028. Who am I kidding? I'll pull all the videos down anyway. So look, there was a video posted up, and I was hoping he would get there, and he didn't go there. That Zach did about the death of the Newstand, and it kind of basically putting the state of the industry into a sense of arrested development. Basically, people didn't have to grow up. And he talked a lot about the kind of human behavior and kind of the different symptoms, or rather how it all occurred, or what we're seeing. But I want to talk about why that matters, because I think that we don't necessarily drill in enough to why the Newstand actually hurt comics. I've done plenty of videos around the discoverability aspect of it, and no doubt about it, it was a big deal. Being able to have comic books in every shop, in every store, in the gas station, in the grocery store, everything. That was a major deal for getting the brand out and getting that recognition. No doubt about it. Obviously very important. But that's not the only thing that the Newstand being lost, that impact hurt us. It hurt comics. And in particular, this idea that comic books basically got to a state where it didn't have to grow up, or to say a different way, didn't have to evolve, I think is very linked to the Newstand falling, and in one very critical way. Or there's several. Well, I'll present the case to you this one way for kind of you to think about, chew on, digest. One thing about the Newstand is it had returnability, which means if you created a book, you would sell it kind of in high volumes to the big chains. I mean, they say the Newstand, but really it's the big chains. And the big chains would buy these books, and then what they didn't sell, they'd tear the cover off and they'd return it. And then, they basically didn't pay for those issues they returned. And what that meant is inside the publisher, they had to have two very important pieces. If you're going to participate in that business, you have to do two things. One, you have to keep extremely diligent inventory of what you're sending out, where it's going. You have to track it coming back in. And you have to basically do the accounting for this part of the job. And that accounting is, I would say it's manual. I mean, obviously you could do things with computers and tracking that way, but there's a labor intensive part to that. And that's your first clue, because here's the deal. If you have a business and you have to basically invest human capital, human sweat, labor, into running that business, it forces a level of maturity just by nature of running the business. One of the things I do in the work I'm doing right now is I have a finance team that works for me, and they balance the books, and they go through all the tax exemptions and the CapEx versus OpEx and all the different things that we do in order to do the accounting for the business. But one thing I do personally, manually, is I have a Excel sheet, and I track the numbers, and the numbers come in, and I put them into the Excel sheet myself, by hand. And there are absolutely better ways for it to be done. You could have an automatic ingestion from Salesforce or SAP. You could absolutely do this in a more manual way. However, the simple art of me taking about 4 minutes a day to look into the numbers, balance the books, put that stuff in there, is highly valuable, because mentally it puts me in a position to understand the business, understand if there's something wrong very quickly, faster than a machine would in this case, because I'm looking for deviations in pattern. If something comes in the morning, it's like, hang on, suddenly the reorders over here are a lot lower. Why? I can start asking the questions. I can start having the meetings, dialing people up, saying, hey, what happened over here? What are you doing over here? It gives me a connection to the business that is critical. Comic books, when they were working the Newstand, they had to do a lot of this type of behavior. They had to count the books going out, count them coming in, reconcile how the money was going to work, keep some money back so that the returnability could be paid out. there were a lot of very precise actions that had to happen or they would lose their shirt. And there are stories back in the 70s and 80s of companies that screwed this up, and it was they basically got a very harsh penalty when this happened. By losing the newsstand, the comic book industry, helped itself by selling through a distributor to the direct market, which is a much easier thing. And you will see interviews with Jim Shooter. I think Joe Quesada has talked about this. I know Dan Didio has talked about this. Several people who have talked about how this dramatically reduced the burden on the publisher. And it did. The suddenly returnability goes away. You don't have to track incoming back. You don't have to kind of float money in different areas in order to make sure you can pay out and pay out. It simplified their business, and that was a plus. It basically reduced some of the staff and some of the labor they needed to do. It also, in a very subtle way, took their eyes off the business, or basically it made it easier to run parts of the business through the distributor and on autopilot. They get the reports, simplifies things. I believe that lack of manual effort is a negative. Over time, it basically, year after year, built up a group that really didn't have to care too much about, reconciling your results. It didn't really care about the consequences, which leads to the second major thing that I think the newsstand and returnability going away hurt. If a book didn't sell, if basically you threw a book out and 80% of the copies were returned, that was a huge logistical mess. You had to deal with all this incoming content. You had to pay it out. Your books had to be rebalanced. It was a bad thing. And there are lots of people's jobs in the 70s and 80s whose job was to predict the returnability rate and to do assessments and do financial forecasting and everything else. But when the book never has to come back, all you care about is the initial sale. And so your behavior changes. Now, all you need to do is kind of trick somebody or hype somebody into buying it for the first time, and then you don't care what happens next. Yeah, so the comic book shop gets stuck with 80% comics they cannot sell. That becomes not your problem. You got to wash your hands of it. And that is super dangerous. Because, in effect, it said that, hey, as long as we got the first kind of gimmick book out the door, doesn't really matter if this is a quality book. Doesn't really matter if there's sustaining, strength to this title. We got our money and we're done. So if you think about some of the comics that have come out there, you're like, why the hell did they sell this? Well, and it doesn't sell. The answer is they were able to get enough of a justification to get that first buy out the door. They didn't really need to think about the rest. And in doing so, it means people didn't have to worry about the consequences of what they were doing. So as we're talking about all this stuff about, creators being, whack jobs on social media or books being printed that have no long-term hope of selling and all the rest, yeah, those things are problems. But most of it springs from the fact that there are no real consequences for putting out a bad book. Not really. And what we've seen in the last 20 years in particular is the business has evolved to constant reboots, relaunches, things that are not really a limited series, but, they're not called that, but they are. There's never any intention to do more than 4 to 5 books. And so it's really about, the business model shifted from need to create a sustainable platform of book selling over time where we have to count what sells and what doesn't and be able to manage that into a different kind of business where we basically say, hey, as long as we get that first book marketed and advertised, as long as we get some people who bought into that, that's all that really matters. We're done. We don't need to think about the rest. And not thinking about the rest means you have plenty of time to be a complete, utter lunatic. And that's exactly why we see the consequence of what we see now. I fully believe the lack of the newsstand hurt comics. It's completely obvious from the books that are sold and the discoverability and new people coming in. But the lack of the newsstand also hurt the people working in comics because it basically meant that you have your own kind of protected ecosystem in the direct market and you can kind of play to that. And as long as you kind of buy into the scheme of market once and be done, it basically allows you to be whatever you want to be. And a lot of the, people involved in comics decided to be their, 16, 17-year-old self, even if they're in their 40s or 50s. Doesn't really matter anymore. You don't need, again, when you're shielded from consequences. This is, and you see this in lots of things, by the way. You see this in, so it's one of the reasons why they say, hey, giving participation trophies to everyone who showed up to play the soccer game with no declared winner or loser is ultimately harmful for kids. Well, because you take away the consequences of, say, not practicing or being, rude on the field or not playing like a team. You don't need to. You're going to get rewarded anyway, so who cares? This is a little bit where comics are at. Yes, they still have to sell comics, and that business is still important. But, taking out returnability meant you take out real consequences. And you take out needing to pay attention to the business closely. So I think those two are pretty big factors, and I think it leads to a lot of the things discussed in that original video, but also in other places. Businesses do best when people are invested, when people are drilled in, when they are caring, when they're looking closely at the results. When you abstract people from it, all bets are off. You see this in a million different industries. Again, I said this in a previous video somewhere else. It's why when you see a business that gets inherited by someone, kind of a legacy business, and the son takes over, but the son was rich and never paid attention to actually how to run the business usually takes. Because the fundamentals of understanding what makes money, what doesn't make money, how you grow an audience, how you do all these things. It turns out that's important. That's why you probably have also seen, there's back in the day, there was the idea that, before you could take over the family business, you had to apprentice and you had to learn the trade. And you're like, well, if I'm running kind of a lumber mill, why do I have to go out and, strip wood and do that kind of manual job? I mainly my business acumen. It's like, yeah, but we want you to be able to feel it. We want you to be able to understand the detail, because if you understand the detail, you're going to be more sympathetic to changes in your business. It's going to be better. But that to me is kind of the answer. So wanted to follow up on that. Thought it was an interesting topic. What about you? What else do you think the Newstand disappearance has hurt? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, as always, and thanks for listening.